Hey, Pastor Bill here. For all of you who are watching our sermons on YouTube, I just want to say I hope they are beneficial to you, and I also hope that you'll come out on Sunday mornings and hear our sermons in person. We have not had our sermons up, a new one anyway, in the last couple of weeks for various reasons. We were supposed to get back on track with that this Sunday. However, due to error, namely me forgetting to set up the camera, we did not record the sermon on Sunday. However, our guest speaker, Pastor Kevin Wiebe, was able to provide me a recording from another occasion when he had done this exact same sermon. He's a great guy, great preacher, and so I hope that this sermon is a blessing for you. Have a good week.
I was almost 9 years old when my parents sat us down and they told us that we were moving, that we were going to be losing our house, that my dad was losing his business, and that we would be moving about 800 kilometers away, and that we were going to be living with my grandmother in her basement. And my grandma was a widow, and she was taking us in because we were about to lose everything. At the age of 8, I didn't fully comprehend everything that was going on, but needless to say, I knew that that was a big deal. We were about to lose our home. My dad was losing his job and his business, and our family was going to move far, far away to the far northern reaches of Alberta, where my parents had grown up. Not only that, we were going to be losing our church community. We were going to be losing friends at school. We were going to be changing schools, and everything was going to be new. It was not something we had planned, not something we had desired, and it was all very, very scary. You see, I grew up in a family in what's the term I later learned is called the working poor. Our family didn't have a lot of money, and we often struggled to make ends meet. And as I just told you about, at one point we even lost our home. Yet there's another side to this story as well. My parents were also extremely generous with other people. They allowed people to come in, and the kind of standing family rule, I don't know if it was ever spoken as such, but it was definitely practiced as such, is that there was always room for one more, rather in our home or at our table. So there were countless times my dad would come home with someone that just needed a meal. He would encounter someone as he was closing up his shop, and someone that just needed a meal or a friend, and so they would come home with us or with him and have supper with our family. Other times people would be in need of a place to stay, and they would sleep on our couch or in our basement. So we had an often revolving door of house guests, people coming and going. Some stayed for a few days, others a few weeks, and others for years. People that I consider lifelong friends, some even like siblings that lived with our family for years. Now, these are two things we often don't think about together, someone who's in the working poor and someone who actually helps those in need in very profound ways. And yet that was my experience growing up. Now, my parents are not perfect either, and our home had all kinds of issues as well. But this was something they did very, very well, and that's something they demonstrated to me all through my upbringing. Since before I was born, this was their practice. People stayed with our family who needed a place to stay or who needed a meal or who needed a friend. That was my experience growing up in Canada, among the working poor, among what we call the lower class. I really dislike that term, by the way, the lower class, as if some people are lesser because they have less money. But my upbringing is one of that kind of difficulty. And I suspect that many of you today can identify with that kind of upbringing, not among the elite, not among the powerful, not among the wealthy, but among those who are working, struggling to scratch out a living while dealing with all kinds of things in their lives as well. My name is Kevin Wiebe. I'm the pastor of New Life Christian Fellowship, and I am thrilled to be able to speak to you today. So hello to the Salvation Army Woodstock Community Church. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with you and to share God's word with you today. I want to begin by looking at a passage in Luke 21, 1-4. This is a passage that's always meant a lot to me, something that's spoken to me about some of these things that I've already started to talk about my life's journey, and that's something that's helped me make sense of my upbringing in some ways. Luke 21, 1-4. While Jesus was in the temple, he watched the rich people dropping their gifts in the collection box. Then a poor widow came by and dropped in 2 small coins. I tell you the truth, Jesus said, this poor widow has given more than all the rest of them, for they have given a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she has. Jesus highlights something here for us. He shows us that when the world is watching out for glamour, that Jesus is watching the meek. While the world is looking for something flashy to praise, the world is looking for these big things, these big donations, and we see it in the news all the time, these oversized checks that people give to charity with thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars given to people in need. Jesus is watching, and he sees someone who is in need herself, and he sees her giving to God of what she has, and it's not much. In comparison to the other gifts that had just been put into the offering box, this was just so small. And Jesus says that this widow gave more than the rest of them because he's looking at her heart. He's looking at her desire to serve God, and he's looking at the level of sacrifice that she has to make just to give that little bit. And this has been my experience with a lot of people in poverty. There's a lot of people in need who give this way to the poor and to the needy. My parents are among them, as is my grandmother, who took us in so graciously when we lost our home. Her being a widow herself, all alone to take care of herself. At that point in life, my grandfather died quite young, and so she was on her own raising kids and taking care of an acreage and all of that, all on her own. And so her being someone that would be and could be considered in need herself took us in even there. And so there's been many people that I've met, and a lot of the people that stayed with us as well, who were in need themselves at one point, so much so that they would stay with our family and were and continued to be extremely generous people, though they may not be able to write those oversized checks to charity. One thing that this passage shows us is that we need to learn how to see the world as Jesus does. As a follower of Jesus, this is something I think we all should be kind of looking to correct in our own minds and in our own lives, is our way of seeing the world. Jesus looks at the world differently than what we do. Jesus looks at the world not being impressed with what we are impressed with, but Jesus looks at the world in the way, because he is God, he looks at the world in the way that God sees the world, with perfect clarity. And he sees things that the rest of us don't see. He sees the heart of a widow when all we can see is the giant checks of the rich. And I find this incredibly encouraging, and also something a little bit perplexing at times, because it challenges the way we see things. It challenges our worldview. It challenges our outlook on life, and it challenges the things that we value. And Jesus challenges us to say, maybe we shouldn't value those things quite so much. I want to look at another story of Jesus in John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, verses 5 to 13, Jesus is teaching to a large crowd of people. They number it at 5,000 men, plus the women and children. And starting in verse 5, Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, "Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?" He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them." Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. What good is that with this huge crowd?" "Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. I want to pause here for now. There's a very significant lesson that I'm pretty sure you've probably heard before if you've spent any amount of time in church hearing sermons, but it has to do with one of the smallest characters in this story. He doesn't say a word, and we don't even know his name. All we know is that he's a young boy, in that he packed a lunch, or perhaps his mother or father packed a lunch for him, but he has a lunch to share. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus, in asking them to help provide food for this crowd, they point out that this would take months of wages. Now, 12 men working for months, that's an awful lot of money to pay for that many people to be fed. So this is a lot of food that is needed to feed everyone. And Jesus, knowing what he's going to do, is asking them this not because he wants them to figure it out, because I don't think they could have imagined what was about to happen, but he asked them this to test them and to show them, like to show them that this is actually a big thing. But then he's testing them, and then he shows them what to do. He tells them what to do. He takes this small lunch offered by this boy, this one boy who's willing to share his lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And then Jesus tells everyone to sit down, and he shares it with them, and miraculously things multiply. Things become enough for everyone to eat. The entire crowd of thousands of people are able to eat because of the power of Jesus working together with the cooperation of this young boy who shared his lunch. So something that we need to remember is to be faithful in sharing what you have. Even a lunch like this boy shared with Jesus was able to be used in amazing and powerful ways by Jesus for the sake of God's kingdom. And this has been my experience growing up as well, sharing just a meal with people. And as a pastor, when we offer hospitality to people in our home as well, it's often those small things that can make a big difference. Sometimes what we do as people is we think about those big things. We think about those big checks to charity. And then we look at ourselves and we think, I can't do that. I can't afford that. Or we look at those big missions trips overseas and we think, well, there's no way I can afford to do some trip to the other side of the world. And we think then we're useless in God's kingdom because we haven't traveled to the ends of the earth. And yet Jesus challenges that way of thinking, that you don't have to have a lot to be of great value in God's kingdom. And this boy in this story, in fact, he does exactly that. He just shares what he has. He takes a different outlook. What if this boy had said, well, what if he did like Peter? Well, that's not enough to feed everyone, so I might as well just enjoy it myself. After all, it was packed for me, so I better just enjoy it. But he doesn't do that. He's willing to share, to take a step of faith and let Jesus use his lunch however Jesus sees fit. And Jesus, in fact, works a miracle with it. Now, sometimes the miracles that happen and the things that I've seen in people's lives aren't exactly like this, where one meal turns into enough food for thousands of people. That's something I've never experienced. But what I have experienced is that over the course of a meal, sometimes the walls that are hardened around people's heart begin to soften. Sometimes the burdens that they're carrying become a little bit less because they're shared with friends around a dinner table. Sometimes the challenges that they face become a little less heavy because they have a friend to face them with. And that's one of the powerful things about hospitality. That's one of the powerful things about offering just a small gift of friendship that is actually not a small gift at all. And it challenges the way we see the world, and it challenges the way that we see poverty and our way of reducing poverty. Now, if you are a particularly keen Bible scholar, you might look at this story and you'll say, yeah, okay, we get the message of the little boy, but that's not actually the point of the story. And if you are thinking that, you'd be absolutely right, because while that's one of the lesser points, Jesus actually wants the crowd and his disciples to get a different story out of this. He wants to get a different point across by doing this. We often stop at the story and then stop teaching there, but the next day is a scenario that helps bring context to the story. It helps us to understand what Jesus wanted us to understand in this miracle. In John chapter 6, verses 30 to 33, so skipping down a bit in the chapter, the crowd comes back to Jesus and they're wanting a miracle. In verse 30, they answered, "Show us a miraculous sign if you want us to believe in you. What can you do? After all, our ancestors ate manna while they journeyed through the wilderness. The scriptures say Moses gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, Moses didn't give you bread from heaven, my Father did. And now he offers you the true bread from heaven. The true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. So they're wanting more miracles. They just saw a miracle the day before, and they come back to Jesus wanting another miracle after he had just literally fed them bread and fishes. And now they are pointing to Moses, saying, well, we often do this today. We come to God, or we come to pastors, or we come to other Christians, and we have chapter and verse, just like they did here. Look at, in the Bible, Moses gave the people bread from heaven. And they're pointing back to Moses. And Jesus reminds them, Moses didn't give you bread. In fact, it was my Father that did. It was God who was responsible for giving them bread. And now he offers you true bread from heaven. So what is this true bread from heaven? What is the point of this miracle that Jesus did the day before? It says, the true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The true bread from heaven is Jesus himself. Jesus is the bread from heaven. Jesus brings things back to relationship. Jesus brings things back to relationship. Yes, he fed the hunger in their bellies the day before. Yes, he met that physical need, as we ought to as well in this world. But Jesus wanted them to get another thing out of this. He wanted them to receive another gift from this miracle, that it's not only about bread and fishes. It's not only about physical hunger, but in fact, he came so that the people may have a relationship with the true bread of life. The true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Jesus is pointing them to himself. He brings it back to a relationship with him. Relationships are powerful things, extremely powerful things, and they can be used both for good and for evil. Anyone who's been in a toxic relationship, you know very, very well how difficult those are to handle. There are abusive relationships where we are taken advantage of, where we are hurt, where we are given wounds that sometimes wound us and damage us for the rest of our lives with things that we have to carry until Jesus comes back and makes all things right. Sometimes those relationships can be extremely damaging. But the potential for a relationship to be damaging is the exact same potential that it has to be uplifting and to be life-giving to us. In the beginning, when God created the world, he created us in his image. And who is this God that we worship? It's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a God who exists in relationship with himself. Then we're made as men and women, as we're told in Genesis, and we're made not to exist only by ourselves, but in communities. We are a people that are made as relational beings. Our default state isn't to be alone. Our default state, the healthy state, is to exist in relationships with others. Now, these relationships, as I said, could become toxic, but these relationships also have the power to be transformative in our lives, to help ease our burdens of suffering. Bryant Myers talks about poverty, and he views poverty as a series of broken relationships. A series of broken relationships. There's 4, and he gets these out of Genesis from when Adam and Eve sinned, they fell, and there's 4 relationships that were broken. The first being a broken relationship between people and God. The second being broken relationships between people and one another. The third being broken relationships between people and ourselves. And the fourth being broken relationships between us and our environment. Now, Jesus came to restore a relationship between us and God. He is that bread of God that brings life to the world. Through Jesus, we can be made right with God because of what he did on the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. That's what Jesus did for you and for me. He died for us. in fact. He loved us so much that he died in our place. And that's a beautiful thing. That is an incredible thing, even as it is a terrible thing that was necessary for Jesus to do that. So Jesus makes us right with God. And as we're made right with God, we're also given the ability and because of God's ways of following God's ways of reconciliation and all of that, we can also begin to make things right between us and others. That's the grace of God at work. Without the grace of God, I don't think we'd be able to truly make things right with others. At least I know I wouldn't have the strength to do such things without the power and the grace of God at work in my life. And so then we can begin to heal those relationships, first between us and God, then between us and one another. And then we get to this other relationship of us and ourselves. How do you think about yourself? How do you view yourself? I come from a Low German background, and for generations there was a phrase in Low German that was told to children. Now I'll say it in Low German and then I'll say it in English. The phrase is "Met dies et nush." And what that means is, you are worthless. The direct translation is, with you it is nothing. It's a way of calling people worthless. And this was told to children generation after generation by their parents. And this is one of those things that I've preached many times in our church as a Low German congregation, coming from that background, that this is something we need to deprogram from ourselves, because God sees us as valuable. God sees us as worth dying for. And yet many of us have this same attitude about ourselves, that we are worthless, that we are nothing. Have you thought of yourself that way? Have you thought of yourself as being worthless? Have you thought of yourself as being unable to offer anything of value to God or to this world? I know I have. I know many, many other people who have as well. Brian Myers calls that a broken relationship with ourselves, and it's listed as one type of poverty. And this is one of the reasons why my parents' example is so powerful and my grandmother's example is so powerful. Of even though they struggle with those questions too, they didn't let that stop them from offering what they had to help someone else in a time of need. And what they offered, it wasn't done with college degrees about how to help the poor. It wasn't done with some kind of 10-step, 12-step process of how to raise people out of poverty. No, it was a lot simpler than that. It was just because of relationship, that because they had a relationship with God, and they read in the Bible that God forgave their sins. And they read about the love that God had for them. And they read about the instructions to do as Jesus did. And they received the love of God and they received the love of Jesus. And then in turn, they take that love and they share it with those around them. And as they meet people that are hungry, then sharing that love meant sharing our food. As they met people who needed a place to stay, then sharing the love of God meant giving them a place to stay. As they met people that were heartbroken, then sharing the love of God meant crying with them. As they met people that were lonely, then sharing the love of God meant being a friend and spending time with them. It comes back to relationship. And that's what Jesus draws it back to in this story of the feeding of the 5,000. He brings it back to this picture of a relationship with him, that he is in fact this bread, that just as much as the people's bellies needed bread in order to survive, they needed food to be able to gain strength to continue on in this world, so too they need to come back to this relationship to Jesus in order to find life for their soul. I don't know where you find yourself today, if you are a follower of Jesus or if you have yet to commit yourself to following him. But what I can tell you is that when we stay close to Jesus, he nourishes us and he gives us strength to make it day by day by day. That's what I watched all my life as my parents struggled with poverty themselves and yet still managed to help so many other people. That's what I saw when I struggled with a seizure disorder a number of years ago, until we got that under control as we went through a very difficult time as a family. And yet day by day, God gave us the strength to make it through because of our relationship with Jesus. And that's what I'm experiencing right at this moment, actually, as my wife is battling cancer, is that the strength of God is given to us day by day. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus teaches his followers to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." And that's what I'm experiencing now, is the daily bread of Jesus, day by day by day. The strength of God given to me because of this relationship with him, this life-giving, soul-filling relationship with Jesus. It doesn't take all the problems away, but it gives us strength to walk through it. And Jesus, just like I've witnessed with many people in my home growing up and in my home now, many, many times, the strength comes not just from taking everything away and making it easy, but strength comes through having a relationship, someone who is there for us. And just as much as we need that relationship with Jesus, we also the church is called the body of Christ here on earth, that we have the privilege, the honor of serving God in this world, of being the hands and feet of Jesus, of serving others as the presence of Christ here in this world. In God's kingdom, the small become mighty. Are you one of those people who thought of yourselves as nothing? Maybe you, like so many in our congregation, were told that you were worthless, or told that you are nothing. I wonder how many people told the widow that she was nothing, or how many people told her that her donation to the temple was nothing. I wonder if she thought that herself, and yet she gives it anyway, and Jesus says she gave more than anyone that day in the temple. In God's kingdom, the small become mighty. In the story of the feeding of the 5,000, it wasn't the disciples or some large amount of money that fed the food, but the power of God working together with one generous young man who shared his lunch with Jesus. Here's another illustration from Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 to 33. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants. It grows into a tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches. Jesus also used this illustration. The kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. See, in the kingdom of heaven, it's the little things that make a big difference. Maybe some of you like to take care of your lawns. I know there's a lot of different products out there that help us to fertilize and kill weeds in our grass. Now, I want you to think for a moment at how hard it is to keep your lawn free of dandelions. That's kind of like what is going on here. Now, most of us don't grow mustard seeds or mustard plants in our gardens or in our yards, but it's kind of like an invasive species. It kind of takes over, and it's a very tiny seed, but it becomes very big, and typically people wouldn't plant them in a garden because of how it would take over. This is the way that he describes the kingdom of heaven, like the yeast working through a dough, or like dandelions spreading across our cities and nations and lands. And if you've ever tried to get rid of dandelions, you know exactly how hard it is to do that. And that's what Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. Something small, something as delicate as a flower, but that can spread all across the land. It's almost like disease, and in this time of COVID, when we know that we're supposed to be physical distancing and keeping our space because disease spreads through proximity. Well, I believe too very strongly that the love of God also transmits through proximity, through relationships, through communities. And hopefully the pandemic will be over soon, and we can get back to some of those really tangible things like spending time together around tables and in living rooms. Because that is one way that we can really tangibly share the love of God with others. And it's one of the ways we can serve others as Jesus served the world. No matter who you are, God values you. No matter who you are, God values you. First of all, he loves you. He loves you so much that he died for you. Jesus came for you because he loves you. And more than that, Jesus doesn't just save us to look pretty and sit on a shelf somewhere like some piece of glass, but he saves us and he allows us to take part in his mission for the world, to give us purpose, to give us meaning, and yes, to give us work to do as well, work that is meaningful, work that transforms us and transforms our communities. And that's the work of sharing the love of God, spreading the love of God like leaven through a dough, or growing like the smallest of seeds into a large plant, or being like dandelions taking over a city. Will you spread the love of God like that? Will you share God's love in that way? Will you help heal those broken relationships at the root of poverty? Would you help heal the broken relationships between people and God, between people and others, between people and themselves, and between people and their environment? Will you follow Jesus in loving others? Would you follow Jesus in seeing the world a little bit differently, not only seeing the big checks to charity as being valuable, but seeing those everyday, ordinary, simple things as being what will change and transform our world by sharing the love of God in these ways? You can make a difference. I know Mark and Naomi well enough to know that they have been doing this for years. And I know that they have been showing so many people how to live this out. And my hope and my prayer is that looking at the scriptures today will inspire you to do the same. That it will inspire you to follow Jesus into those simple and ordinary things. You may be small. You may feel worthless. But in God's kingdom, you are mighty. You are valuable. And you have a purpose. Thank you for allowing me to share with you today. May you go in peace.